Usuka of McKinsey, who's coming up now. Good to see you. Thank you for being here. Is a PhD in chemistry who leads something called the Center for Analytics and Real-World Evidence in the Pharmaceutical and Medical Products Practice at McKinsey. He's previously worked at pharma companies. He was at Celgene, and he was head of genome informatics at Roche. So he comes out of the industry. Now he's at McKinsey helping other companies do it right. So please, take it away.
Thank you. So a couple things. That's a very nice introduction. Thank you, David. About me. Number one is hardcore pharma. So I know this is a healthcare conference. I'd love to learn more about healthcare. The only thing I really know about health is the ability to treat patients through new therapeutics. The other thing about my background is it's hardcore informatics and machine learning. So there's a lot of great things going on in artificial intelligence. I would love to learn more about them. The parts that I know and will be commenting on this morning are really the use of cognitive computing and machine learning to impact the healthcare landscape. The other thing is that probably a little caveat I'll give up front is that I am a data scientist, and so I will ask for your indulgence if I start to get twitchy and point over. I don't have any charts to show, and usually my manner of speaking usually is deep in data and spotting trends. So with that, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the future of healthcare, and especially the future of pharmaceuticals. Pharmaceutical value in the future as brought forward by machine learning is going to come from where pharmaceutical value has always come from, and that is focusing on the unmet medical needs of patients. You saw this at Roche, Genentech, Celgene. These are companies that, while I was there, really focused on, there were lots of things that they could do in terms of diagnostics, in terms of other ways to get revenue. And anytime that there were hard decisions to be made, at least the ones that I was familiar with, they focused in on the unmet medical need of patients. And that really was a great way to steer any kind of strategic framework. The future of pharmaceuticals, in that sense, is going to look a lot like the past, but that does not mean that the indications are not shifting. So we have seen over the last 5 years, especially in oncology and some of the information content that is brought by technologies such as genomics into personalized care for oncology, we have seen this become a very treatable, almost chronic lifetime disease. And that is something very similar to HIV. And this is a trend that's going to continue. Other changes in indications, however, are going to be the result of some of the demographic shifts of the patient population. So we're going to see an increased emphasis on Alzheimer's, on longevity, on different aspects of depression, especially. These are different disease areas or indications that have been very intractable in the past because of the data, because we didn't have that great medical imaging that we are beginning to have now, and also because the patient populations just weren't as developed. So these are some major things that you're going to see in terms of the future of healthcare and how it relates to the past. Pharmaceutical companies are going to derive value in the future with machine learning, again, in the same ways that they did in the past. What are those? Those are new drug approvals, those are label expansions, and driving adherence. New drug approvals. We tend to think of this entirely as science. You do the best you can in the research phase. There's lots of machine learning that's being applied to identifying new targets, qualifying or de-risking a compound, understanding the relationship comparative genomics-wise between some of the test species and the humans, all trying to set you up, your compound or your biologic, up for success in clinical trials. And then we throw it over the wall, and then let's see in a placebo-controlled study, let's see how well the compound does. I think machine learning is turning that paradigm, if not on its head, making really interesting twists to it. So we already know about the application of genomics data and bringing better targets forward or qualifying compounds better. or making clinical candidate selections. What we don't talk about so much is the really interesting uses of machine learning and cognitive computing around the selection of, for example, clinical trial sites. Not all sites may be stepping away from probability of success and just looking at your ability to enroll patients in the indication, not to default when you've been activated as a clinical trial site. This is where so much money is spent. Hundreds of millions of dollars are spent in pharmaceutical development, especially late phase, phase 2B, phase 3, only to have sites that have been activated default on getting patients. So one of the really tractable areas for machine learning is in doing such things that seem just almost boring and operational, like which sites should I go to so that I can enroll patients for my trials. If you look then beyond new approvals, and by the way, there's a huge area around FDA and regulation in the clinical trial process. Besides the selection of the clinical trial sites, the kinds of evidence that can be brought to bear as part of a clinical trial that were not part of a previously designed study, so-called pragmatic trials, adaptive clinical trials, the application of real-world evidence as part of the evidence package for an approval or for an expanded indication. These are really transformational things that are coming from machine learning. Second area, as we look at label expansion. Label expansion, let's be clear what we're talking about. We're not talking about off-label usage. This is very much about beyond the label usage. You find an efficacious molecule. You look at something like Revlimid, and which was originally approved for a very narrow indication. Patients that had myodysplasia patients that had failed one prior therapy and had a certain chromosomal abnormality. And then step by step, Celgene just kept on chipping away and getting this approved for new indications, finding new ways to treat patients. So that's a big area that machine learning is impacting. And then lastly, if you look at adherence, one of the most frustrating things about healthcare right now is you have a therapy that would benefit a patient. You have a patient that has taken that therapy, and then that patient just stops taking it. What happened? Were they not receiving medical benefit? Was it not efficacious for that patient? Did they experience an adverse event? Is it a copay issue? Have they switched to another therapy? Real-world evidence and being able to track unique patients at this level is giving us a really interesting window on what is going on with adherence. Not just about driving adherence to increase revenues. It's really about how to understand when a patient is receiving benefit from a therapy in the real world. You know, these molecules are studied the heck out of when they're in the clinical phase, and then they get released post-approval, and it's not really clear what happens to them. That is very much changing because of 4 data types. So you have claims data, you have electronic medical records, you have clinical trial data, and then of course the hottest of them all is genomics data. Electronic medical records used to be just so boring. It used to be all about trying to stop the cost getting sucked out of the system and try and make actual built-in efficiencies. Whereas now, electronic medical records is one of the very hottest topics because it enables you to put together what is going on with a patient in the real world with what kind of therapies that patient is taking. So if you look at the work like out of Vanderbilt University, where they have put together electronic medical records with genomics profiles of 100,000 patients, you're now getting into how does a patient respond to therapy based on their genomics profile. So it's really profound stuff that's going on. Machine learning is at the real forefront of this because so many different data types are coming together. Lastly, probably the only other data type I'd like to mention, we didn't talk much directly about clinical trial data. And you know, the usual supposition about this is that a company, a sponsoring company, gets the data, cranks on the data, produces a regulatory report on it, and then eventually releases it to ct.gov, clinicaltrials.gov. A new paradigm is developing where at least some of these companies, through the Drug Dev Consortium, are sharing this data among themselves. So it's a huge opportunity to understand what works and what doesn't at the clinical trial operations level. It's very much a pre-competitive area that's going to benefit, I think, a lot of the different players in the industry. So with that, I guess I'll take questions. I just gave you a very brief overview from a pharmaceutical perspective of how cognitive computing is impacting all of the value levers that are, how the landscape is changing for those value levers, but that they're going to remain constant, which is new drug approvals, label expansions, and increased adherence.
Somebody back there.
Yep, yeah, thank you.
So it's a bit of a long-winded question.
Identify yourself, please.
Oh, I'm Arundhati Parmar. I'm editor of MedCity News. It's a long-winded question, so bear with me a little. My brother actually works for a tech company here. And the CEO of that company sort of believes that through AI and deep learning, certain entire categories of employment in the health industry could be eliminated, for example, in radiology. So first of all, what's your response to something like that? And do you see other disruptive forces as AI comes into healthcare?
Right, so we didn't even have a chance to, there are a number of other data types, radiology contributing to one of the major ones, which is imaging. You know, imaging is just experiencing, as a field outside of machine learning, is experiencing a transformation because we're now able to capture and store really high content images. It used to be that there was a pathologist, a microscope, a dark room, and sort of manual processing of these biopsies. Now you get the ability to apply software. You know, you look at IBM Watson, Definians, different approaches for image analysis that are able to standardize and compare these images. And in some sense, it's a microcosm of what's going on across pharma R&D, where standardization and increased automation are yielding a really powerful force in being able to do data science because you have standardized data sets that you can compare. And so it's not just a pathologist or a radiologist reading something and they read it in their own personal style and a different person would read it in a different way. Once you agree on certain standards and you process and have a much higher throughput of these images, it yields benefits around analytic benefits that you wouldn't have realized by the kind of manual processing of it. Yes?
Oh, go ahead. I hear concerns among clinical trialists that because of social media, a lot of patients on clinical trials are now comparing results, contaminating the data. In other words, have you had this side effect? If so, yes, no, it means you are or are not on an active agent. Is that a concern? Or what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I mean, I don't know whether that specific aspect is a concern. I mean, what I will say is that the clinical trial process, which has served us so well since 1974. You know, we're talking about 40 some years now, 44, 45 years. This is going to change ridiculously in the next 4 or 5 years because you can't stop the social media discussions. You can't stop the very laudable work that's being done like patients like me. You look at the work around Duchenne's muscular dystrophy and these approvals that are let's say, taken a very different path than a traditional approval because there was patient advocacy involved. These are genies that are just not going to go back in the bottle. So what we're looking at is how do you understand and how does the FDA fulfill its mission, which is a marketed therapy must be safe and effective. Fundamentally, it all goes down to those two things. How do you then fulfill that mission in a world where a clinical trial might be 1,000 people, but immediately upon approval, you have data in hundreds of thousands of people? And doesn't this seem backwards? Doesn't it seem like the sample size issue should be dealt with up front because your statistics would be much better? Always with approvals, you're getting reversion to the mean because of the small sample size in the first place. So, not to comment or dodge the specific question, but the data types are going to change fundamentally, and I think the regulatory authorities are very much aware that the FDA process, the approval process right now, is a parallel universe to the real world.
Your friend has something over there.
Yeah, by the way, I think you can add a couple of other interesting data sources like contextual information, behavioral information, in addition to images and EMR and the claims and the genomics. Clearly with AI, the volume of data create emerging insights, and these emerging insights can give you factors that influence health, but they may not be very exact at how specifically they influence health. And we've seen that. We did a trial together with MIT where we started measuring the pressure between the skull and the brain, the fluid, and we found that through our vital signs data, we could, with 99.9% accuracy, predict what that pressure was. So you didn't need to drill a hole. However, there was no clinical theory behind it. And of course, we're going to find more and more of these interesting insights, but there is no clinical theory behind it, and it may be more than clinical. So how do you see that? And getting back to your FDA story, that may be a little bit far out for the FDA, but it's going to give us tremendous insights.
Right, and that is one of the key challenges, I think, not just in this industry, but across any application of machine learning, is that you have an observation, you discover a feature, there seems to be a correlation between two events, but what you really need is causality before, one, you're going to invest hundreds of millions of dollars bringing it forward through clinical trials, and two, before regulators are really going to understand it. Because regulators always are going to focus on two things outside of the clinical endpoints. They want to look at patients that dropped out and patients that have died. And the story is always going to be there, and in the absence of a clinical hypothesis and an explanation of causality, you're just on very, very weak ground to defend any sort of these anecdotal observations that happen during a clinical trial.
I think we have to wrap, but that was great. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, guys.
Really appreciate it. Thanks so much.